Rook is playing the partner pairing of Gilanra and Kodama, basically just mono green big stuff. Raven is playing Myrkul, Lord of Bones, with a prison sub-theme. Hellkite is playing Tazri, Beacon of Unity, with a Adventures and Dungeons & Dragons theme. And I am, of course, playing my budget $20 Duke Ulder. Unfortunately, the audio for the match got completely corrupted, so I'm going to be commentating it. Raven wins the roll and plays a command tower, passes to Hellkite, who plays a forest, passes to me, who plays the Tapler Hold Garrison, passes to Rook, who plays a forest followed by a Llanowar Elves. First spell of the game, everyone groans. Raven plays an Ailey, jokes about how I'm the Raven Guard and I'm supposed to be protecting him because his username is Raven, and passes. Hellkite and I play our lands and pass, and Rook plays a Sakura Tribe Elder. We have a discussion about Infinite Myrkul and the benefits of doubling season in the deck, while Rook accidentally searches up a non-land card as his basic land. We start talking about how Blood Sun interacts with bounce lands, as Raven plays a bounce land. Hellkite and I play our lands and pass. Rook suddenly realizes that his forest isn't actually a forest, and fixes his mistake. He casts a Selvala and passes. Raven and Hellkite each play a land and pass. And I excitedly draw and play a Temple of the False God on turn 4. Rook casts one of his commanders, Gilanra. Raven casts Archon of Sun's Grace, and we return to our discussion about the benefits of doubling season. Hellkite misses a land drop and passes turn. I play a land and tap 6 mana, and then have to decide between casting Duke Ulder or Warstorm Surge. There's a lot of stuff happening over here, but I want to get value out of my Warstorm Surge, so I play Duke Ulder. We spend a minute doing the math to see if Rook can cast Kodama and then also activate Selvala to add 6 mana, but it's impossible. So instead he casts Avatar of Growth, and each player searches for 2 lands and puts them into play. Hellkite points out that Avatar of Growth only costs 3 mana. And because he has a bigger creature now, Rook casts Kodama using Selvala's mana. He passes the turn, and then we all remember that Selvala is supposed to draw him cards. Raven casts Myrkul, Lord of Bones, and draws a card off Selvala. We suddenly remember that I should have drawn a card off Duke Ulder, so I do, and discard it. I suggest to Hellkite that he probably shouldn't play a creature, so instead he decides to ramp, and gains the initiative. On my turn I draw land, play it, and cast Luminarch Primordial. When it enters, for each opponent I choose a creature they control and exile it, then they gain some life. In response, Raven sacrifices Archon to Ailey to get a token of Archon. The token of Archon is an enchantment, so it sees itself and creates a Pegasus token. We go to combat. I give Luminarch Primordial haste and Myriad and attack with it. The tokens enter, and I choose 2 creatures from each opponent and exile them. Combat damage is dealt, and I gain the initiative. I laugh evilly as I search my library for a land. On his turn, Rook casts a Kodama's Reach, following it up with an Emerald Medallion. He points out that this time he actually searched for basic lands. On his turn, Raven pays 5 and casts Moldervine Reclamation, following it up with a Woe Strider, following that up with a Viscera Seer. Hellkite casts Hama Pashar and follows it up with a Burrowin of Clan Under. I go to my turn and forget to trigger the initiative. Everyone's cool with me going back, so I put the card that I drew back on top and then move both to the bottom, because I do not need lands right now. I finally cast Warstorm Surge and then talk about how cheap my deck is. Luminarch Primordial is 25 cents, Warstorm Surge is 25 cents. I play a Roving Scholar, hoping to draw into something good and draw a land. When it enters, it's going to ping Viscera Seer for 2 damage. In response, Raven sacrifices it to scry and forgets to draw a card, but I think he does that later. We go to combat, and once again I give the Luminarch Primordial haste and Myriad. However, it doesn't really feel fun to just exile all of my opponent's creatures every turn, and because Luminarch Primordial reads up to 1 target creature, I can choose 0, so I choose to only exile 1 creature from each opponent, and I let Hellkite choose which one he wants. And target Rook and Raven's face with the Warstorm Shirt. Rook untaps, wonders where his board went, and taps out to cast Archetype of Endurance. All of his creatures now have hexproof. While Raven takes his turn, I check my deck list to see if I have an answer to the archetype, or if I just literally can't do anything. Turns out I have a couple of answers. Well, I can gain control of him with Mob Rule. Raven jumps ahead of me by explaining he does have an answer, and destroys all creatures, which mostly hurts me. But I'm happy to see the Luminarch Primordial go, because it was kind of slowing down the game. He casts Elvish Rejuvenator, finding a tapped Terramorphic Expanse. Hellkite tells me he's going to be taking the initiative, casts Sephiroth, and then casts Loot Dispute, taking the initiative. He casts Coveted Prize, searching for something, and then passes the turn. I untap, lament not having the initiative, and then look at the card that I drew. It's a gain control of effect. Interesting. I play Duke Ulder and consider my different options for where the Warstorm Surge should target, and decide to hit the Elvish Rejuvenator, because I want to make sure that Myrkul is utterly uncastable. It's at this time that Raven realizes he should have been drawing a card for all those things he sacrificed, and draws a couple cards. Rook taps 7 mana and recasts Kodama. On his turn, just as I was hoping, Raven recasts Myrkul, Lord of Bones. He casts Devoted Druid, and doesn't realize he can make infinite mana. He passes the turn. Hellkite triggers his initiative and gets a skeleton token. He casts Feywild Caretaker. Triggers the initiative, so he reveals the top 10 and puts a Yuntai Malazan onto the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters. He completed the dungeon, so Sephiroth returns Hamapashar from his graveyard to the battlefield. He completed the dungeon, so Loot Dispute puts a 5/5 dragon onto the battlefield. He casts Midnight Pathlighter, so now all of his creatures can't be blocked except by legendary creatures, and whenever an opponent is dealt damage by one or more of his creatures, he gets to venture. Raven postulates that maybe he used his board wipe too early, and he gets attacked by a 4/4 skeleton. It has menace, so he can't block.
We all have legendary creatures.
Raven decides it's a good time to put 2 -1/-1 counters on Devoted Druid, which kills it. He then gets back an enchantment that produces infinite green mana, which gives him a Pegasus token. Hellkite begins venturing into the dungeon of the Mad Mage and passes the turn. On my turn, I cast Involuntary Employment on Myrkul, Lord of Bones, to gain control of it until end of turn. At the beginning of combat, I give Myriad to Myrkul, Lord of Bones, and attack with it, getting 2 Myrkul, Lord of Bones to enter the battlefield. I choose to keep one of the tokens, sacrificing the original. The token Myrkul sees the original Myrkul die, and I exile it, returning it to the command zone. The non-creature enchantment version of Myrkul enters the battlefield, and I choose to keep it, sacrificing the token creature. I play an Outpost Siege, choosing Cons, so that I'll be able to draw an extra card each turn, sort of. On Rook's turn, Hellkite convinces me to use my answer to Raven's Devoted Druid. I play a Cathar Commando and sacrifice it to destroy Devoted Druid. Enchantment Myrkul then gives me a copy of Cathar Commando, and I joke about how I am the Raven Guard for Raven's Myrkul, except it's my Myrkul. Oh yeah, this whole time I've been using my Warstorm Surge triggers to destroy Hellkite's board, which, now that I'm thinking about it in retrospect, was probably a bad idea since his board could attack the Myrkul player. Rook casts Old Gnawbone. Kodama triggers and he puts a Dawnglade Regent onto the battlefield. His stuff now has hexproof. Again. This game now includes both Initiative and Monarch. Raven is confused why I still have a Myrkul token, so I explain to him the interaction. He says, I don't like it. On his turn, he casts Skybind, intending to exile the Myrkul token, and then he reads Skybind, which does not exile enchantments. So instead he flickers the 5/4 unblockable. Raven plays Shadowheart, which allows him to sacrifice another creature to draw X cards, where X is that creature's power. Raven plays Cartel Aristocrats, which allows him to sacrifice a creature to gain protection from a color. He attacks Hellkite with a 2/2 Pegasus, gaining the initiative and venturing into a dungeon. On his turn, Hellkite misreads Yontam Malazan and attacks with it, along with some other creatures, attempting to gain both the Monarch and the initiative. He half succeeds. He asks me if I have an answer to Old Gnawbone, assuming he can get rid of Hexproof. I say I do, because if I play the Archon, I'll be able to get 3 Warstorm Surge triggers and deal 9 damage to Old Gnawbone. Hellkite casts From the Catacombs, which allows him to return a creature from an opponent's graveyard to the battlefield under his control.
Oh!
Hellkite chooses to return Archetype of Endurance.
That is the coolest way to remove hexproof. Oh my gosh. Hell yeah.
He casts Tazri and passes. At the beginning of my upkeep, Outpost Siege exiles a mob rule. I gain control of all big creatures. At the beginning of combat, I give Myriad and Haste to Old Gnawbone. Because Raven is at 56, I target him with the Old Gnawbone Warstorm Surge triggers, though I should have targeted the Archetype of Endurance and given myself an Archetype of Endurance token off of Myrkul. In the spirit of fun, I target everyone with their own creatures, which took a lot of clicking. Hellkite begins tracking his own Tazri commander damage. After blocks, Raven decides to sacrifice some of his stuff to Cartel Aristocrats in order to draw cards. I decide to cash in the commando token to take out his card draw. After damage has been dealt, I have both the initiative and I'm the Monarch. I tried to venture down into Trap to make Raven lose 5 more life, but I've already ventured down into Lost Well, so I can't. Instead, I decide to goad Kodama. Because I'm a genius, I get to draw a card at the end of my turn, and I draw another land. On Raven's turn, we all remember that I had an Old Gnawbone in play when I dealt all that damage. We do some calculations, and I create 25 treasures. I then offer to sacrifice all 25 treasures for no value, because I could not possibly use them on anything.
Our life totals are almost the same as they were at the beginning.
Rook casts one of the best CDN writtens I have ever seen. He gets a Meteor Golem and a Vigor, using Meteor Golem to destroy my Myrkul token. Kodama triggers and Rook puts Zendikar Resurgent and Garruk's Uprising onto the battlefield. He draws a card and I joke that he should have targeted Vigor with Meteor Golem. Rook goes to combat and tries to attack me with Kodama, which is goaded.
That is literally the one attack you can't do.
Instead, Rook sends Kodama at Hellkite and Dawnglade Regent at Raven. After combat, Rook accidentally puts a Knot of this World onto the battlefield from the top of his library. During his turn, Raven recasts Myrkul and says that I look scary. This time, instead of just asking if I should sacrifice the treasures, I hold a vote, and ask whether or not I should sacrifice the treasures. Rook doesn't care. Raven doesn't care. Hellkite says I should keep them. Raven passes the turn. I finally get attacked for the first time of the game by a couple of creature tokens in order to take the Monarch and the initiative back.
I've been attacked finally. It's turn 12. I've been attacked.
Hellkite plays some dungeon cards, does some dungeon things, and passes the turn. Outpost Siege exiles a removal spell, and I draw another land. After spending a couple minutes thinking, I decide to target the Cartel Aristocrats. In response, Raven protects the Cartel Aristocrats by sacrificing Shadowheart. Hellkite empathizes with my desperation to draw cards, and offers to allow me to attack him to take the Monarch and the initiative. I venture deeper into the dungeon and draw another land. Raven remembers that he should have had a Skybind trigger when he sacrificed Shadowheart to Cartel Aristocrats, and targets the Duke Ulder, but I've already drawn a card off of venturing into the dungeon, so he decides to instead target a treasure token. At the end of turn, I draw for the Monarch and draw another land.
Oh my!
I reveal most of my hand to the table. Raven and Hellkite speculate about what that one non-land card in my hand might be. Rook casts a Beanstalk Giant, cheating out an Ulvenwald Observer. He casts a Nissa. cheating out a Guardian project. He casts Rampant Growth in 3 visits, casts an Elemental Bond, and admits that he is probably too tired to remember all of his triggers. He goes to combat and swings Meteor Golem at me to take the initiative and the Monarch. On his turn, Raven casts Eidolon of Blossoms, which draws him a card. It will also draw him a card whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield, which means whenever one of his creatures dies, he's going to be drawing a lot of cards. He casts Burnt Medic, which turns into an enchantment that makes it so he can't take damage. Raven casts Sterling Grove, which gives all of his enchantments Shroud. He then sacrifices Sterling Grove to search for an enchantment and put it on top of his library. He searches for Sphere of Safety, which is ridiculously redundant with the Burnt Medic on the battlefield. We all mutter about how he could have had a finisher, but then he admits that his deck doesn't actually have a finisher, and he has to go, so he leaves the game. On his way out, he says something about how Torment of Hailfire isn't an enchantment. On his turn, Hellkite activates Tazri to look at the top 6 to see if he can find something. He attacks Rook with everything, and most of it dies. Hellkite casts Eerie Ultimatum, returning all of the creatures that just died to the battlefield. He starts resolving all of their abilities, but the end result is that he ventures into the Undercity. A lot. This is what his board looks like after he's done. Note that Ravenloft Adventurer is a 10/10. On my turn, I exile Solemn Simulacrum with Outpost Siege and draw Phyrexian Vault. I lament how losing a player makes my deck worse, get some lands, cast both, and go to combat. Hellkite points out that Ravenloft Adventurer prevents dice triggers from happening, so I don't actually get to draw a card off of Solemn Simulacrum, so I sacrifice it to Phyrexian Vault to draw a card. I pass the turn to Rook, who untaps and should probably be able to win from this position. Hellkite helpfully reminds him that his 2 biggest creatures are goated and have to attack me. Rook taps a couple of forests to cast End-Raze Forerunners. He draws a card off of Zendikar Resurgent, draws a card off of Garruk's Uprising, draws a card off of Guardian Project, and draws a card off of Elemental Bond. He uses the Kodama trigger to cheat out a giant Adaphage and draws 3 more cards. Rook casts Hall of Gemstone, and follows it up with a Nyxbloom Ancient. Hellkite explains how Nyxbloom Ancient doesn't double additional mana, so Rook's forests are only tapping for 5. Though it will triple Nykthos, which is going to tap for a really big number. Rook casts a Chroma's Memorial, which gives all of his creatures Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, Haste, and Protection from black and red. Hellkite and I reveal our hands to each other. The game's over. I check to see how long it would be until I would draw a board wipe. Rook goes to combat, attacks with everything, and wins.
KO.
Thinking back on this game, the deck did exactly what I wanted it to do, although I think I misplayed it a couple of times. Like early on in the game when I played the card draw creature without drawing cards off of it. I really shouldn't have done that. I should have waited to use that to draw 3 cards, since drawing cards is a thing this deck has a really hard time doing. However, I didn't expect to draw that many lands. The second misplay was destroying Hellkite's board with the Warstorm Surge triggers. I should have let him keep it so that he could attack other people, because most likely they were not going to be coming at me. Kodama and Myrkul got to show off what they can do, and they are very powerful commanders. With both of them at the table, it was a little bit hard to decide who I should kill first. However, since I've lost to Myrkul before, I knew what the deck can do, and I targeted a little bit more than I targeted the Kodama player. As for General Tazri with Adventures, I enjoyed playing against it. I think I would probably enjoy playing it, and so I'm going to be ordering the deck. It's actually not that expensive, since most of the creatures are really cheap. I'm planning on making more gameplay videos, some for 5-cap, some for EDH, and if you'd like to support what I do, click the link below to sign up for my Raycon premium subscription of Audible VPN Kamikoto Knives. Okay, but seriously, I'm thinking about starting a Patreon at some point, but I don't even have an audience yet.